Hello, my name's Jonathan Clark. I'm also known online as djbolivia, and for today's video I'm going to give you a very in-depth, comprehensive review of a mixer produced by Allen Heath. It's called the Xone 4D. It's one of their higher-end professional mixers. It integrates a conventional audio mixer plus MIDI controls plus an internal sound card all into one unit. Okay, now I've talked about this mixer in a couple other videos I've done. For example, the series I did about about performing live, doing live DJ performances using the Ableton Live software. I got into this mixer in a little bit of detail in parts 4 and 5 of that series, kind of the culminating two sections of that 5-part series. However, I'm going to try and cover everything in a little bit more detail today. Okay, so before we get started on the mixer itself, let's take a look at the front and back. So we'll see what the inputs and outputs are like on the back and on the front before we cover the front panel, the top panel. So looking here at the front of the 4D, you'll see that we have two headphone ports, 1/8 inch and 1/4 inch, and of course the volume control for these two is up on top of the on the main board. It's at the bottom of the headphone section. And over to the right we have the microphone section, and let's see, so this controls the input sensitivity, the record level, input level of the microphone. And of course, if you don't have a mic hooked up, you should always make sure that's turned down just so you don't get noise through the channel. We have a low frequency and a high frequency attenuation, a pair of attenuation knobs, and they'll go down to -12 up to +12 decibels on each knob. I'm not actually sure what the center frequency for these two things is, or for the width range and the drop off, but basically think of it like a bass way to reduce or increase your bass, and same thing for treble. And of course, this is a port for an XLR input. XLR is a low impedance signal. So you don't want to use a microphone that is a high impedance one that ends with a 1/4 inch plug at the end. Those aren't as good. And be careful that you're using a dynamic mic. Don't use what's called a condenser microphone, because a condenser microphone needs a phantom power source, and this mic does not provide phantom power. So your best bet, low Z, XLR based, simple dynamic mic, good vocal mic, something like that. Before I get to the back of the mixer, I'm going to have to go off on a tangent here for a second and explain something to you about decibel levels. Decibels measure the strength of a signal, and basically it's based on a logarithmic scale. And so if you have a signal at one level and you want it to be twice as much power, it has to be 3 decibels higher. But it's a logarithmic scale, so to be 10 times as much power, it needs to be 10 decibels. Now, so you can see that's not a 1-to-1 correlation. So if you go up 10 decibels, it's 10 times as much power. Let's say you start at 10 decibels and you go to 20, 10 times as much power. You go up another 10 decibels, 10 times as much power again, which means it's 100 times as much power at the 30 decibel level as it was at the 10. Go up to 40, another 10 times as loud, so 1,000 times as powerful. 50, 10,000 times as powerful. Okay, and it goes up and up. Now, the human sense of hearing is quite amazing. The difference between the absolutely very quietest sound a person can hear and a level at which hearing damage happens in a very short time, that difference in power of the sound is about 1 trillion times. Okay, 1 trillion is 10 to the 12th, and so basically you have to go up to 120 decibels. You're going through 12 steps, where each time it's 10 times as loud as the previous step. Okay, so why does this matter? Well, talking about decibels, there's a lot of signals that you'll see in the audio world, like XLR signals, RCA, TRS, 1/4 inch. They're measured in various types of decibels. Now there's a whole lot of variations, like there's dB decibel, There's dB small v, dB large v, dBu, dBm. We don't need to know the difference between them at this point, and to be honest, not many people other than devoted audio engineers even understand the differences. You can look it up online if you need. But with line level signals, which I'm going to have to talk about here in a second, there are two different main levels. There are consumer line level signals. Example would be RCA. And those are usually at -10 dBV. There's also professional line level signals. Unfortunately, they're a different standard, and they're usually at +4 dBu or dBm. And an example of that would be an XLR line. Now, there's also quarter-inch lines, known as tip ring sleeve, TRS, and to really complicate things, those can be either of the two line levels. They can be -10 or +4. Okay, so basically, if you tried to adapt from an RCA, which is -10, to an XLR, which is +4, you're definitely going to get a signal strength difference. You're either going up or down 14 decibels, approximately, depending which direction you're going. If you're adapting from RCA to quarter-inch, it depends on what the quarter-inch at the other end is, but you may be fine because it may be exactly the same thing. Or it could be that 14 decibel difference. Okay, so you might have to play with you might have to either boost your level or attenuate it, drop it 14 decibels to make it actually work well when you do an adaptation. Now, the reason I needed to explain this, aside from the fact that it's good to understand what a line level signal is, the back of this mixer allows you to connect turntables. And 3 of the 4 channels have phono inputs on them. And a phono input is at a much, much lower level than a line level. Maybe I didn't say that right. Actually, the phono signal coming in is at a much, much lower level. So the problem is, because it's so low, it's quiet. It needs to be boosted up. So anytime you have a mixer with a phono connection in the back, there's also going to be a phono preamp inside that mixer that takes the signal from the turntable and boosts it up so it's at a line level, whichever line level, so it's more useful within the mixer. Now, the reason this is important is because you've got to understand which of the inputs on the back of your mixer are turntable inputs, because if you plug a signal that's already loud into it, a line level signal, and that's pretty much everything else in existence, like CD players, iPods, laptops, you name it. If you plug one of those signals in, and then it goes through that phono preamp, which boosts it more, then you're going to have an extremely hot, loud, distorted signal, which is bad for everything. Okay? So the moral of the story is never plug a line level signal into a phono input on any piece of equipment. So looking at the back of the mixer, we've got our power supply, we've got XLR outs for our mix out, which is sometimes called sometimes called a master out on other mixers, sometimes called a mains out. Then, looking at our 4 channels, you can see these inputs. And you can see that the phono inputs here on the 3 channels that'll take a phono have these plugs in them. That's good. That's to make sure that nobody accidentally sticks a line level signal into those. Okay, now if you're going to stick a turntable into one of them, that's fine. Just pull the plugs out, plug in your turntable. Allen and Heath knew that turntables are increasingly less common these days, unfortunately, and some people may not ever end up using a turntable with their mixer. So this mixer is actually built so you can take it apart and quite easily disconnect the phono preamps from these channels and turn them back into line level. So you can, with a little bit of do-it-yourself knowledge, take the mixer apart, fix it so that, you see how input number 4 has 2 line level inputs? You can have the same thing on all 4 of those if you wanted. I wouldn't recommend that you do it yourself. Get a proper electrical technician to do it for you. So anyway, that's how that's how all the analog inputs work on the channels on the back of the mixer. Now we have outputs for the monitor, RCA output, line level. We have our two send returns, FX1 and FX2. Now, FX2, you can see that it says record out also. This is where I would hook up my audio recorder if I was, say, recording a DJ set. Okay, the only thing is be careful because you have a button on the front of the mixer that you have to turn on in order for a signal to be routed out to here. Okay, the sound card within the mixer, it is rated as 24 24-bit sample depth and 96 kilohertz sample frequency. That's good. Basically the 24, that's how wide your sample is, how much resolution when you take a sample. And the frequency, the more often you take samples, the better. Okay, so CDs were recorded at 44.1 kilohertz, or 44,100 times per second sample frequency, and only a 16-bit sample width. So the resolution of this sound card is quite a bit better than CD, and it samples much more than twice as often. Okay, so this sound card at 2496, that's definitely studio professional quality. Anything you'll see these days, you'll probably never see something that exceeds those levels. Okay, so the sound card within here has the capability of carrying 20 simultaneous channels of sound. So it's basically set up with 10 inputs, 10 outputs. So our 4 channels on the mixer, the 4 analog channels, each one has 2 inputs, 2 outputs, 2 mono inputs, 2 mono outputs, which gives us effectively a stereo input and output for each of those 4 DJ channels. And so those are labeled 1 through 8, the 8 monos. And then channel 9 and 10, whether it's going in or coming out, is always reserved for the digital on the sound card. So you can see right here that we have SPDIF, and SPDIF stands for Sony Philips Digital Interconnect Format. So there's 2 types of cables for this. The first is a coax cable, and it takes RCA phono sockets on the end. And the second is optical, or fiber optic, and that takes a connection at the end called a TOSLink socket, TOSLINK socket. Okay, so if you've only got channels 9 and 10, which is basically a single stereo channel coming in and out, how does the mixer know which one to use? Is it using the coax line or is it using the optical line? Well, if you're talking about the in, then the sound card knows how to figure it out just based on what it can see coming through, and it goes through the coax as a default if both are hooked up. And for outputs, what it does is just outputs to both simultaneously, so it doesn't have to pick. So if you're trying to get an output, a signal from the mixer on the outputs, it doesn't matter which cord you use, they're both going to work. Okay, we also have MIDI in and out. We have a game MIDI port, so that's if you wanted to hook up a like a joystick or something like that. We have a grounding post, and so that's if you have turntables with a ground wire in the back to eliminate some of the hum, then you can screw them into this, and that grounds them. We have a foot switch, and the foot switch, just a 1/4-inch plug, and basically that it's a foot switch. You can use it like a MIDI switch, MIDI controller sort of thing. And finally, there's our USB connection, USB-B end connection that goes to your laptop. Okay, so I think that's all that we need to talk about on the back of the mixer, and of course the power supply is over on, or the on-off switch is over on the left. Let's get into the front of the mixer. Okay, so moving on to the main mixer itself. I guess before we start looking at some of the features that it has, I should mention what you need to do before you use this mixer. If you're using it in conjunction with a laptop, i.e. you're using the Soundcard functions of it, or you're using the MIDI controller functions of it, then you're going to have to install drivers on your computer. So the unit comes with drivers on a CD, DVD, but I would not recommend installing those. I would recommend going online and looking for the most up-to-date drivers possible. Also, do you know the difference between what a driver and firmware is? Okay, the driver is the software, the instructions that are installed on your laptop, so the laptop understands how to talk to the mixer. The firmware is the same sort of thing, but it's the stuff that's inside the mixer. So it tells the mixer, it's the programming of the mixer itself. Okay, so everyone, most people realize that with a piece of equipment you often have to install drivers for it to work with your computer, or your computer will install the drivers automatically. But what a lot of people don't know is that although this comes with a basic version of firmware, straight from the factory, sometimes that firmware also gets updated. So it is possible to update the firmware, and so what you should do is, at the start of things, like for instance, watch this when I power this up. You're going to see a number pop up here. 2.02. Okay, so this mixer, when I first got it, the firmware was at version 1.00 or 1.01. I can't remember which it was. So that was the factory stock original firmware, because the mixers, I've had this for several years. However, Allen Heath has updated that firmware several times in the meantime, and so what happened was eventually I went online, realized there were major updates to the firmware, so I went to the Allen Heath website, and there's a section where you can download a piece of software which kind of guides you through all the steps of updating the firmware. So what it does is it talks to your computer, or lets your computer talk to the mixer, figures out what firmware is on there, figures out what needs to be downloaded to update it properly, and it guides you through all the steps. It says, like turn power on now, unplug, plug in, this stuff, this, that. Okay, so when you go through all those steps, it permanently updates the firmware, so you've got a better set of firmware. So do that if you can right off the bat. Get fresh drivers from the Allen Heath website, go to the Allen Heath website, do a firmware update. Okay, so now let's turn this on again. Watch what happens. Watch the lights that flash when I turn this on. Okay, so we had some activity up here. We had a bunch of lights flashing here while it was powering up. Generally, right now, nothing else is lit. Specifically, the lights down in this section are not lit. Now, when this comes up, I guess I'm going to talk about the MIDI aspects of this mixer first. So let's talk about the MIDI mapping. This mixer comes with two default MIDI maps in it. Okay, you can see down here on these buttons we've got a map 1 and map 2. Map 1 is the default for Tractor, and map 2 is the default for Ableton, and those are the two programs which are quite commonly used with this unit. So how do we know which one it is? Okay, well, what you have to do, turn your mixer off. This time, see it says power on setup. Okay, if you hold that button down when you turn power on, I'm going to get the whole flashing light routine, but then I'm going to get these lights flashing 3 times. Okay, once they flash 3 times and they've come onto solid, let go of the button. At this point, we have 2 steps that we have to go through, and then we go back into regular operation mode. Okay, the first step is to assign which MIDI channel is going to be used for communications. Now, if this is starting to sound intimidating and you don't know what I'm talking about, don't panic, because you don't have to go into setup mode to be able to use this mixer. I'm just explaining for the people that really understand MIDI a little bit more detail. So we need to figure out the channel. There's 16 different MIDI channels available. Default is 16. If you happen to understand binary, hopefully you do, then you'll realize that the reason there's 16 channels is because we've basically got a 4-bit word which gives you 16 choices from 0 to 15. Okay, so basically what's happening is you're picking the binary word and adding 1 to it to get the channel number. So 0 equals channel 1, 1 equals channel 2, right on up to 15 equals channel 16. Okay, so all you have to do is set this in binary, and what you do is you twirl this around. So if you know binary, you know that's 1, which means you're on channel 2. That's 0, which means you're on channel 1. That's 2, so channel 3. 3, which is channel 4, and so on. So eventually you get right up to 15, which is channel 16. So that's the default. That's what pops up when you go into setup right away. You probably don't want to change that unless you're very technically competent, you know what you're doing. So to get past that step, all we do is press the button once. Okay, so now we're in the mapping mode. That's important. Okay, right now map 2 is lit up. Okay, that's the Ableton mapping. So that is the default when you turn this thing on. If you're not, so if you're using Ableton, you don't have to do anything. If you are using Tractor, what you want to do is switch over to map 1. Okay, and then I would press the button to go back into regular operation mode. Now there is one other thing that I want to explain. This one says light connection, it's lit up. If you are in, let me think about this. If you're, okay, let's leave it in Tractor mode. If you're in Tractor mode and you have this lit up when you go back into operation mode, then all 8 of these lights will stay on constantly. If you have it turned off, they will normally be dark, although they can be turned on with MIDI messages. Okay, so that is the Tractor mode. Always on, or only on with MIDI messages. If you go into Ableton mode, it's slightly different. Lit up means that when you're in regular operations, anytime you push these, they will toggle between on and off. If you take it off and go into operations mode, same thing happens as in Tractor. The only way they turn on is in MIDI, is when a MIDI message lights them up. Okay, so that's not really important. That's, I mean, some people in a dark club may want to affect the behavior of those lights. Really, I think it's moderate. It's fairly inconsequential for most people. Okay, I'm going to pretend that I'm using this with Tractor, and so I'm going to switch it to that, and then I press this. Things flash 3 times, and we're back in operation mode. Okay, so I'm going to turn it off. Go through that once more very quickly. Oh, I forgot to hold it in. So we're not in setup mode. Now all these lights are on, but remember how in setup mode it was only the 4 on this side, on the left side, that were on. The reason all 8 are on right now is because that's the last state that we had it in. We had it in buttons all lit for Tractor mode. Let's go back into setup mode. Instead of turning it off and holding the button while we power up, you can also, say you're in a fixed installation where you're not able to turn the unit off and on, you can also hold both of those. Oops, that didn't work. Oh, it did work. I apologize. Okay, let's try that once more. I got fooled by the fact that these are lit up. So hold them both down, you'll get 3 flashes, or 2 flashes I guess. So we are in setup mode. Right now we're in the channel assignment. See, that throws you off. Right now we're in channel assignment. We want to stay on channel 16, the default. So I'm going to leave that the way it is. I'm going to hit the button once. And now I am back into my setup mode. I would rather not have these lights on all the time, which confuse me. So I'm turning them off and I'm switching back to Ableton mode. Okay, and then there. So I'm back into operations. Okay, so once again, if I'm using this with Ableton, all I have to do is turn it on from scratch, from no power. If I need to switch into tractor mode, I can hold them both down. I'm in channel selection, punch once to set the channel, then I'm going to switch to tractor, and then I'm going to lock that in and go into operations. Okay, so now this is totally set up for being hooked up to a laptop using tractor. Okay, I realized that was kind of confusing. Now let's look at the MIDI controls that we have. We have up at the top, both sides, we have a series of endless encoders or rotary encoders. These are digital controls, and you can actually, depending on the mapping mode, you can change the way that they function, whether they go with a note stream or control messages. If you understand MIDI in depth, you'll understand what I mean. Otherwise, let's ignore that. Basically, it's a rotary encoder. It also has a push button function, which is good for on-off effects. Now, one thing I will caution you on, which I did not explain in my live DJing video, is with these rotary encoders, if you're mapping in, say, Ableton, basically, because they're digital encoders, what they do is they send out a stream of data called binary complementary, I believe it's called, 2's complementary, 2's comp. When you're mapping any endless rotary encoder, when you're mapping that within Ableton, if you look down on the very bottom left of the screen, there will be a section with a little drop-down menu asking you what type of encoding you're using for that knob. And there's probably about 10 different choices, I think. Make sure you set it to 2's comp if you want it. That's basically the default. That's the easiest way to set it. And if you need to learn any more about it, I'm not going to get into detail here, look that up, because if you've got a piece of equipment with endless encoders, you should try and understand this. You could check it out on the internet. Okay, so our next set of controllers are rotary knobs, panning potentiometers. These are analog knobs, and they've got a limited fixed range. Then we have some analog sliders, analog faders. Okay, and then moving down here, we have some momentary push buttons. You can use them sort of for on-off effects. We have quite a few of those, 12 on each side. Here's another rotary encoder, like the top. We have an optical jog wheel, and I forgot to mention this in the other video too. See how you've got the 4 points of the compass? You can actually press down on those 4 points, and that's another control signal that can be mapped. If you press, you can't do a southeast click. It's gonna figure out which of the two, whether you're closer to east or south, and it'll just pick one of these 4 if you kind of push in the middle between two of them. Okay, and then finally we have some lighted controllers. So we have a lot of options already for MIDI mapping. It gets better. If this is not, if this doesn't give you enough, a big enough number of controls to work with in your MIDI mapping, you can take it a lot further. All of the audio controls in the center of the mixer can be MIDI mapped. Okay, that is phenomenal. So let's say that you're using this, the center part, as a mixer, and this is obviously your audio mixer channel volume on channel 1. You could, in theory, not only have this affecting the volume as it comes through channel 1, but you can also MIDI map this control to something like, say, let's say that we map it to the, in the Ableton, we bring in an EQ3 on channel 1, and we map it so that the low rotary knob, the low control, is mapped to this thing. And top setting would be 0 decibels, normal, unattenuated, non-attenuated. And down at the very bottom, you have the Ableton low dial on your EQ3 down to the lowest setting, which I can't remember what that is, but I think it's maybe negative 60 decibels. Okay, so the effect would be that as you're playing, as you're bringing the volume up on a song, not only are you actually bringing up the actual audio volume through the channel, through the audio mixer, you would also, at the same time, be bringing up the, I guess it'd be this for the camera, be bringing up the value of the low cut knob on the EQ. So as you're fading in from nothing, it's like you've got a high pass filter where the sweep is going downwards. So the highs are coming in at the start as the volume comes up, and as you get closer to the top, it's adding the bass. And so it really gives you a different feeling as you're bringing stuff in. Okay, so that's pretty cool, being able to map all this stuff. Now, of course, you do have to be careful, because when you're mapping an audio control to something in Ableton or whatever, one control is doing multiple things at once, and you may not always want that to happen. Okay, now the other thing too, if you're running out of controls, if you hold down this button, the shift button, let's see what happens. Okay, shift comes up, you can map all these controls a second time, and at any time you want them to be used in the shift setting. Okay, so hold it down for a sec. Think of it like mapping A, and I'm not going to say mapping 1 and 2 because that might confuse you with this, but let's say we've got two map fields, map A and map B. So the default map A is always on, but if you go into shift, it brings you up to map B. You can play with all this stuff, and hold that down again, you drop back down into map A. Okay, so that's pretty cool. That works on everything except the crossfader. For some reason, I don't understand, the crossfader cannot be mapped in the shift field, in the B mapping zone. Okay, so one minor thing that I probably should have mentioned too earlier when I was talking about installing the drivers, if you're using a Windows system, and this applies to a lot of things, not just to this particular unit, if you're using a Windows system and you're installing drivers, if you happen to have multiple USB ports on your laptop, on your computer, try to pick the port that you're always going to use to hook this up to, because the installation of the driver is assigned to that port quite often, and well, it depends on the operator, which version of Windows, etc. It depends on a lot of little things, but in general, it's safe to assume that your installation may be tied to that particular USB port, and if you try to use a different USB port, either it won't work in some circumstances, or more frequently it'll appear to work, but it works with degraded performance. Okay, so it's always nice to use that same USB connection port if you're working with high-end equipment like this. All right, so let's go into the audio part of the mixer. Now, where do we begin? Let's do a little bit of a demonstration with the filters. Okay, so we have 4 channels here, and each channel, I already talked about the fact that it can be line, phono, or sound card. Here are the switches. So down for any of the channels. Okay, I just moved them all up. So up is either line or phono. And so green up is line, down is phono, up is line, down is phono, up is line, down is phono. And remember that this one, channel 4, is only 2 line connections. Okay, if I punch any of these ones down, then we go to the sound card for inputs. And each channel has two little red toggles also. The top one, for all four settings, if it's up, it is channel input for the sound card. If it's down, it'll assign the mic on that one, FX2 on that one, FX1 on that one, or the mix on that one. The other button determines whether the input is pre or post fader. Okay, so for any of them, down is pre-fader, which means that using your fader does not affect the signal input. Up is post-fader, which means as you drop your faders down, you're not getting a signal. Beyond that, next we've got trim controls, and they go from, they've all got a, I think it's called a détente in the center, détente, I think, French, in the center, and you can go to -10 or +10 on the gains. Now I'm going to be using channel 3 here, and I've already figured out, let's play something. Well, let's put it back onto the right setting. Okay, so the ideal setting for us is, unlike the Pioneer mixers, the Pioneer mixers have green lights for the bottom, then you get into the orange, amber, caution zone, and then you get into the red lights. For the Allen Heath, this one, we've got a whole bunch of greens. Once you cross into +0, you're starting to get blues. Once you get to +10, you're starting to get red. And so red is kind of bad. I think it's got 20 decibels of headroom from 0 to distortion, but to be safe, you don't want to see a whole lot of red lights. Your ideal operating range would be with the music not really dropping below that. Let's give it a little bit more. Okay, so we often want to see at least one blue, but we don't want to see it peaking up to the red. Now, this is something interesting. On the Pioneer mixers, when you drop your volume, there's no signal. There's no lights coming on the channel meter. In this one there is. Okay, so why is that? Well, basically the channel fader is, it's okay, this is a minor problem. In the manual for this, it describes the channel meters as being pre-fader and pre-EQ. Okay, I'm dropping that out. Nothing's changing. So pre-fader, yes, that's correct. If I drop my EQ levels, the lights go away. So it is not pre-EQ. Okay, let me backtrack a bit if you don't understand what this means. A lot of people, when they think of a mixer, they think of it as if the channel faders are down all the way, that's when nothing is happening because there's no sound going through, right? And as you turn up the volumes, then it must mean that all of a sudden signal must be starting to come through the mixer. So here nothing's happening inside, here stuff is happening inside. I don't like to look at it that way. I like to look at it as the opposite. When the volumes are up, that's when nothing is being done to affect the signal. The signal's always there, okay? But as you start dropping the faders, then you start getting attenuation. You start getting components inside the mixer knocking that signal out of the way, okay? So a pre-fader means that the signal that is coming through there, the function within the mixer that's making these lights flash is happening before the fader affects anything. Pre-fader. Okay, so it doesn't matter what the fader is doing, it doesn't matter the fader's position because it's later. The signal lights are coming on pre-fader. Now if this was a post-fader mixer, that's what the Pioneer is. The Pioneer mixer looks, the lights look at it after the fader has affected the sound. Okay, now let's apply that same concept to the effects channels. We have 2 send returns for external effects units, okay? FX1, FX2. FX1 can be pre or post. So if you go pre-fader, then what is sent out when you turn up the effects is the original source audio. I should really do that in channel 3. Okay, so if I turn this up with pre down, it's the original signal going out to the effects processor. If I put it up, which means post, that means the signal going out to the effects processor is post fader, it's after the fader, which means turning the fader down changes the amount of signal going out to the effects processor. For effects unit 2, send return 2, which is the second row, you don't have a choice. It's always pre-fader. Okay? So again, this is one of these minor things that when you start getting into DJing or audio engineering, stuff like that, and you start understanding fancier signal flows, more professional setup, stuff like that, knowing whether some things happen pre or post other things is very important. So let's see how these filters work. Basically, the Xone 4D has 2 filters, exactly the same on each side. One is called the filter 1, one is called filter number 2, but they do the same thing. And on each of them, we've got a couple different controls. We've got the on-off button, and when it's lit, it's on. Then we have a analog pot knob which controls the frequency, the cutoff frequency, and it goes from a low of 20 Hertz up to a high of 20 kilohertz. And so remember that the average human with good hearing can hear a range of frequencies of sound that go from about the very lowest frequencies of 20 Hertz, bass frequencies, up to the highest of about 20,000 Hertz or 20 kilohertz. And those are the trebles. So that gives our frequency cutoff. Then we have 3 different switches to choose what type of filter we're going to use. LPF stands for low pass filter. The low frequencies are allowed past the filter. BPF, band pass, and that means just a narrow band within the frequency spectrum is allowed to get past. And HPF is high pass filter, so just the highest frequencies are allowed to get through. Okay, then we have a resonance knob, which goes from a low to a high setting, mild to wild. Mild is low. So that's basically what we've got for our filter controls. Now, to make them work, okay, remember we're working on channel 3 here. Each of the 4 channels has a little metal switch here, and in the center position, off, it means that the channel does not feed through either filter. But if, for example, on channel 3, which we're using, if I flip it to the right, it feeds to filter 2, which means this filter is going to affect what we hear. Okay, so let's give it a shot. We'll start with a high pass filter, and remember with a high pass, all the high frequencies above a certain cutoff get through. So you will hear everything above a certain cutoff. So if that cutoff frequency is very low and everything above it is getting through, then most of the sound is getting through. So let's see what happens when we we turn it on. Doesn't sound any different. So yes, maybe everything is getting through. So as we raise that filter cutoff to a higher and higher frequency, it should mean that less and less of the low frequencies are allowed to get through, which means our bass sounds should be disappearing. And that's exactly what we find. Okay, so let's turn that off. Now let's go to the opposite. Let's go to the low pass filter. So with the low pass filter, it means all the lowest frequencies get through. So if our frequency cutoff is really quite high, and knowing that everything below the cutoff frequency is allowed past the filter, then when that cutoff frequency is really high, most of the sound should be able to get through. So if that's the case, let's put that cutoff frequency really high, and when we turn it on, everything should still get through and the sound shouldn't really change. And that's exactly what happens. Okay, but as we lower that cutoff bar, then only the lows are allowed past, which means the highs above that thing are going to start disappearing. So our treble is going to start to disappear. And that's exactly what we hear again. Okay, and then the final effect, the band pass, just allows a fairly narrow band in the middle to get through, which means when it's up high, it's going to be just a very trebly range, and as it comes down, instead of being a wash like it does with a high pass, it's going to be just a narrow band that starts getting through. Okay. Now, so what's this resonance? Well, basically the resonance, when you turn resonance up, what it does is it feeds some of the filter output back through the filter again. So what it does is it causes it's like a feedback mechanism. So it causes a feedback loop, and when you've got a feedback loop, things can get out of control. So let's see what happens when we've got the resonance set very low. Okay, doesn't sound that strange. I mean, the low frequencies are disappearing, but let's see what happens when we put it up to wild. Okay, so essentially wild is causing that, but as we turn it down, it's more like just EQing happening. So I think the moral of the story with these filters is that if you're going to turn on the band pass, it doesn't matter where you are, a lot of the sound is going to cut out. So don't turn on your band pass unless you're doing it at a point where it's okay for the sound to disappear suddenly. You don't want to do it unexpectedly in the middle of a phrase or something like that. You want to do that at the start of a bar. 3, 4, 2, 2, 3, 4. Two, 3, 4. Okay, but for the other two, for the high pass, make sure that if you're ever going to turn on the high pass, start with your frequency all the way down to the lowest value, and that way the sound isn't changing immediately, and it will only change when you... Otherwise, if you start at the wrong end and turn it on by mistake at the wrong point, most of your sound disappears. Okay, so to be safe, to be cautious, always make sure your filter cutoff is all the way to the left when you're about to use the high pass, and of course all the way to the right when you're about to use the low pass. Now the next thing that you should know is that the settings that we've played with on the filter so far are a constant. They're not changing. If you know what an LFO is, you realize that it can add movement to stuff that you're doing. It's used in audio production all the time. LFO stands for low frequency oscillator, and anything that changes, that vibrates, sound vibrates, and the frequency is expressed in hertz. Hertz always, no matter what you're measuring, is a measure of the frequency. It's the measure of the number of cycles per second as something vibrates back and forth. Okay, so light waves are one frequency, very, very high frequencies. Sound waves are quite low frequencies overall in the spectrum. Okay, so a very deep bass sound, 20 hertz, that means that all that's happening is the sound molecules are vibrating 20 times per second. If you've got a high-pitched sound, let's say way up at 15,000 hertz, 15 kilohertz, then the sound molecules are vibrating fairly fast, 15,000 times per second. Anything that oscillates. Okay, when you're into creating sounds, synthesizers, the way they create sounds is you have an oscillator. It means something oscillates, it bounces, and oscillators create sounds, and so they'll be up in high ranges, like from 20 hertz to 20,000 kilohertz. That's the range of sound that people can hear. LFOs, a low frequency oscillator, is the same sort of type of oscillator. It just means low frequency. It's slow. It's a low frequency, low number of times per second. It happens slowly compared to the vibration speed of sound molecules. So an LFO, quite often, you'll be measuring in fractions from, say, a 10th or a 20th of a cycle per second to 2 or 3 cycles per second. Okay, so remember the slowest vibration for the deepest noise is 20 hertz, 20 cycles per second. An LFO, you might be using rates of 0.1 hertz to maybe 2-3 hertz at the most. Okay, an LFO you can actually hear. If you look at current in North America, electricity, in most places in North America, electrical current has a frequency of 60 hertz. So it's alternating current, AC power. It's not like a battery, not direct current. So what happens is the power flashes on and off, or I should say reverses polarity, 60 times per second. If you look at a fluorescent light bulb, it looks like it's on constantly, but the polarity is switching 60 times a second, and the bulb is actually flashing 60 times a second. And so it seems like it's constantly on. Maybe you've stared at one for a while and you've realized that it looks like it's kind of got shifting patterns in it. That's because your brain is smart enough, it's kind of picking up on the fact that, wait a second, that's not constant, it's actually flickering on and off. Within Canada, Quebec, I believe, used to have current at a different frequency, AC current. I think was it only at 50 hertz? So somebody who was used to looking at light bulbs, fluorescent light bulbs from somewhere else in Canada, who went to Quebec, could actually notice the flicker because it was slower than their mind had gotten used to. Okay, well, instead of a fast flicker like that of 50 times a second, what happens if you're flickering, your frequency of oscillation is only once per second? Okay, so what'll happen is you'll get a cycle where it's going boom, 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 or however fast seconds are. If you've got a noise, let's say that you've got a filter on a frequency, and your normal noise without the filter sounds like a steady hum, but if you've got a filter on it that's cutting the frequency in and out once every second, or let's use volume instead of frequency, I don't think I can hum that well. What'll happen is you'll get a okay? So volume or amplitude can be affected by an LFO. Pitch can be affected by an LFO. Maybe the pitch is rising and falling, so you're getting a okay? So the LFO is used for different things. In music production, critically important. Now, the LFO is going to have a tempo, the same as our sound, our audio has a tempo. Dance music, let's say that an average dance track is at 128 beats per minute. Boom, 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 boom. If we go with an LFO, chances are that the period, the cycle frequency of the LFO is a lot slower. We're going to start our song, start our track, and we've got it at a tempo of about 128 beats per minute. Okay, what I'm going to do is I'm going to try and have this LFO affected in a pattern that goes every 4 beats or 1 bar. So it'll go 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3. Okay? So in order for it to affect it once every bar or once every 4 beats, the tempo of the LFO has to be happening only a quarter as fast as the actual beats per minute of the song. Okay, does that make sense? So if you want a cycle every 4 beats, well, we've got 128 beats per minute, but we only want to have 1/4 as many cycles happening. So divide 128 by 4 and we've got 32. So we're going to be looking at a cycle time of about 32 cycles per minute, which is about a cycle every 2 seconds, or about half a cycle per second, 0.5 hertz. Okay, the math. Don't get too caught up in the math. Let's figure out how do we do this intuitively to make it sound good. Okay, well, we want it to do 1 cycle every 4 beats. Well, let's use our tap tempo, and we'll tap, but remember, we're not tapping in time with the beat. We want to tap once every 4 beats. Okay, so let's give it a shot. 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4, 1. Okay, so as long as you tap it, at least I usually tap it 5 times. Okay, so it's flashing about once every 4 beats. So let's see what happens when we've got a filter on. Okay, we have to assign the LFO so it knows which filter is being affected. Now, it's in the center position, it's 1 plus 2, so it definitely is going to affect both sides if you leave it in the center position. If I had it over to the left, so it's on 1, it's not going to do anything to this side when I turn it on. Okay? Or if I've got it over to 2, it's only going to affect this side. So let's leave it on 2 for a second, and let's see what happens when we turn the depth up. The depth determines how much this LFO affects the sound. Okay, so 0, the lowest setting, means even if you've got this LFO set up and working, nothing's going to change. But as I change the depth, okay, see how it's going in a cycle of every 4 beats? 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4, 1. And then as I drop the depth back, it doesn't have that cyclical effect anymore. It's a complicated concept, but it's kind of cool. So once you understand, I mean, I could have shown you just exactly all you have to do. You know, I could have said, just hit that a bunch of times, and as you change the depth, it's going to come in and out. But I would rather you understood the background, the science behind it. Okay, so as your default, you should make sure it's always at 0, so the LFO is not doing something that you don't understand. Now you can, I believe you can set the LFO at whatever tempo the music is playing at. So let's look at the BPM counter for a second. Okay, right now it is not set at anything. This mixer, like the Pioneer mixers, can figure out what the tempo of the music is, and all you have to do is, I'm going to switch it, right now it's set to a FX2, and there's nothing on that, so I'm going to switch it past the off position over to mix. It's going to start thinking about the beat that's going through here. There will be a little tiny dot flashing in the bottom right corner of the BPM window, and it'll flash every time it thinks there's a beat. And you watch, after not very long, it should try and hopefully figure out that this is playing at 130 beats per minute. Okay, so let's switch that over. See, it's flashing. It's trying to think. Will it figure it out? Ah, there we go. So it realizes that it's 130 beats per minute. Okay? And I believe I can set my LFO by holding this down. The LFO frequency will come up, and I can just hit tap, and that locks, see, it locked the two of them together. So that could be good for setting the LFO quickly so it cycles once per beat. Okay, so let's assume we're not going to be using the filters anymore. Let's turn those off. What else can we do? Well, if we've got something where the mixer can't analyze the tempo itself, let's say it's having problems. I think the BPM only runs from 70 up to 400, which is pretty high. But let's assume that there's a problem. Let's say we've got a drum and bass track. That's a really good example. A lot of, say, jazzy organic drum and bass might have, you know, it's going boom, but no, that's not the right beat. Okay, so maybe that low kick or the low sub bass is only hitting on the first beat of every bar. Or maybe it's hitting on the first and third beat of each bar. So, okay, if that's the case, you're smart enough to know that it should be, okay? So I just tapped in a tempo of 200. The mixer may miss half those beats, and I mean, that's pretty fast for drum and bass. Let's say drum and bass should be at 180. Okay, good enough, 167. If the mixer is missing half the beats, it may think that your tempo is only 83.5 if you've got it set to auto-register the tempo, so you may have to tap it in. Now, what if you're tapping it in and you're syncing this to an external system? You can actually let this mixer, if you're going through USB and you're talking to a computer or whatever, this mixer can act as a master or host for the clocks. And so with Ableton, like for instance, up in the very top left corner there's an external button, so you click that on. You'll set this so either Ableton is the master or the clock is doing stuff. But if you are trying to, let's say you're trying to synchronize Ableton with the nudge buttons, or say you're trying to synchronize your BPM to something that's already playing, you can actually do a nudge in either direction on the clock tempo on this. If this is being used as the master, that's useful. Okay, and as soon as you let go, it goes right back to whatever. Now, if I want to change my tempo to 169, it's kind of hard to do that. If you hit tap when you're up at a higher value, you can actually reset it. So watch, if I click to the right and I hit tap there, it locks in the higher value. I haven't figured out yet how to do minor changes, like say from 167 to 169, 170. I'm sure there's a way. But one thing I have learned to figure out how to do is if you hold in the tap for a minute, it moves over. See, we're at 182. Well, it actually knows it to 1/10 of a decimal point, not just to, you know, the nearest whole integer. So this is not actually at 182 beats per minute. It's at 181.7, which I can see by holding it in. Oh, sorry, now it's at 182. I can change the fractions of a decimal by hitting this while I've still got tap held in. Okay, So that's how you can play with the BPMs. I'm not sure that there's a whole lot more that I need to tell you about that. I mean, that's probably a good primer for anyone who understands this sort of stuff. Go through the manual that came with this. The manual's actually really quite clear. I was quite impressed with it. I actually read the manual. And, you know, this will all make a lot of sense. So what else do we need to know on this? Well, here's your master volume. There's your booth monitor volume. Here's your Q to mix ratio. That's pure Q for the headphones. That's adding more mix. And of course the level on the headphones goes from low to high. Okay, pretty straightforward stuff. And whether or not your effects are included in the Q mix. So let me see, is there anything else I need to tell you about this? Alright, I can think of a couple things that I overlooked already. Number one, the LFO tempo, the range on that, you can go from 15 to 200 BPMs on the tap tempo, which is the same as 0.25 Hertz to 3.33 Hertz. Okay, so that's the range that the LFO will take. Now the LFO, you can also map your curve. With an LFO, normally the default curve is, it's not a sine wave or anything, it's a triangular. Okay, so imagine the wave dropping, coming back in, dropping, coming back in. So over time it creates a triangular pattern. You can actually, very rudimentary set, draw the shape of your wave. Okay, so there's a way to look this up in the manual for the exact directions, but there's a way to enter mapping, LFO map mode, and then once you're in it, these 8 faders here describe the shape of your wave. So if you wanted some sort of sine wave, for instance, you could have something like this, where it's kind of going up, down, and imagine these right beside. So you're kind of getting the up and down pattern. If you wanted a very square wave, you could probably do something like that. If you wanted a triangular, you could do something like that. And then you just turn it back off, and that's the way that your LFO is going to react after that. So that's pretty advanced, but that's pretty cool. The crossfader, you need to be aware that it affects the amount of signal sent to the filters. For the EQs, for the values on the EQs, in case you're curious, the center point frequency for the low is 120 Hertz, for the mid is 1.2 kilohertz, and for the high is 10 kilohertz. Okay, I'm not sure what the width is or the drop-off patterns are on those, but that's where they're centered. And they drop down to a complete fade out if you go to the left of the détente, and if you go to the right, you can go up to plus 6 decibels. As always, EQing is much better as a subtractive process. You're better off taking stuff out instead of trying to push it, because you avoid pushing your signals too hot and causing distortion. So anyway, down to nothing or up to plus 6 on any of these. And a final thing that I forgot to mention was pickup mode when in MIDI mapping. Okay, remember how we could go, let's say that okay, we can hold this down and we're into a second set of mapping. I call it map B. Okay, what happens if you've got a control, like say this one? This one is mapped to 2 separate things. Let's say that in regular map, this is mapped to something where, let's say it's mapped to the high frequency control on an EQ3 on this channel. And so the normal value, when nothing is being really affected, is at the top, or close to the top, is at 0 decibels, okay? But let's say that in shift, in the second mapping, this is mapped to a flanger, and the very highest spot is the most flanger. It's when your wet dry is at 100%. Okay? Can you imagine what would happen if absolute values came through instantly? Because if we were in this mapping mode, the generic one, where this is controlling our high cut on our, it's not a cut, I don't know, the high pan pot on our EQ3, if we're controlling that here, but when we press shift it goes into flanger, and that picked up values immediately, absolutely, then all of a sudden just going into shift mode is going to turn your flanger on. That would be a disaster. It would do all sorts of unexpected things, and so the only way you could really use shift mode as a viable alternative is to really plan your stuff out, to figure out how can you know, what pairs of controls can go together where flipping back and forth doesn't make a huge mess. Okay? So this is not a problem though, because Allen Heath has what's called pickup mode. And pickup mode, this is something I should have talked about in one of the other videos, the APC40 video that I did not too long ago. I just kind of brushed over it. But basically what happens with pickup mode, well, I've said that we're not in absolute value mode. Let me backtrack for a second. MIDI transmits data in 8 letter words, 8 bits, binary, okay? So a single binary word can be from a value from 0 to 127. So on this slider, let's pretend that 0 is the lowest value, 127 is the highest. So there's 128 different positions here, okay? So when the mixer is feeding the position of this fader to the Ableton software, it's going to send a value between 0 and 127. There are no in-betweens. There's no such thing as decimal point, no such thing as floating point notation in this, okay? There's only 128 choices. So let's say that when I talked about the switch, absolute, if I shift into switch, if I switch into the shifted MIDI map, what happens if it doesn't do anything right away, but it registers as soon as a different value comes through? Okay, then that would still be a problem, because let's say that my fader at the top is at 127, the highest value. Well, okay, Ableton's already figured out that you don't want to send a signal right off the bat, but what if the second that you start to move it, you know, my plan is to move this down to 0 fairly quickly, but in moving it down to 0, I still have to go through 126, 125, 124, 123, slowly all the way down to 0. Okay? If I'm hitting the fader like this, it feels pretty fast to me. You know, for a human, it's a fraction of a second. For a computer that thinks in billions of operations per second, that movement of that fader takes an eternity. And the computer is fast enough that as you're moving down, it's sending those control signals through. So for just a brief second, you would get signal going to the flanger, you get a spike of audio that happens way faster than a human can make things happen. Okay, so basically what I'm saying is that if the fader, upon moving, sends a signal, it's still a problem. Okay, but it has to send a signal when it's moving, otherwise how does it communicate? There's a mode within Ableton. There's also the same mode built into this mixer, which is really nice. They've built the redundancy. It's called pickup mode. And essentially what happens is, if I had my flanger set at, let's say it was set at a low value like 5. Wait a second. Is this going to work? Yes. Okay. So flanger in shift mode, high frequency on EQ, not in shift mode. Okay, so let's say that we're in shift mode and we've got the flanger set at low values. Let's say it's at 5 there. And we go into the other mode, we play with the EQ, and then we go into shift mode a second time. As this fader starts moving, it will send control signals from its high number, let's say it's at 110, on its way back down, 110, 109, 108, but pickup mode means it won't actually react. It won't do anything in the software until it picks up the value that it was at when it left shift mode, which means I can play with this as much as I want, and as long as I stay above that 5 value, which is what it was at when we exited shift mode last time, anything I do above 5 is not going to register. And it's only when we finally drop low enough for even a fraction of a second, once we hit 5 once, it goes, oh hey, the fader's back where it was when we left off, it must be okay to start using it again. So basically, flanger would, if that's the high setting for the flanger, in the example I just gave, nothing's going to happen until I go down here, but as soon as I go back up after I've done the pickup at the original value of 5, it starts working totally normally again. So that's what pickup mode is. That's, I think, all I need to explain about this mixer. Okay, so you can see we're dealing with a very sophisticated piece of equipment. I've covered most of the stuff. I mean, some of the stuff, the high-tech stuff, I glossed over a little bit. But if you're into this kind of equipment, you know what I was kind of getting at when I talked about that stuff. Definitely, it's not a cheap mixer, but I believe, for someone looking for a good piece of equipment which has an audio mixer, 4 channels to boot, MIDI controllers, sophisticated MIDI controllers, plus a decent, good quality sound card inside, you can't go wrong with this piece of equipment, and that's why a lot of really professional DJs and performers will use it. Okay, that's all I gotta say. Thank you for watching. If you want to see me using this in a real setting, I've got a YouTube video, episode number 155 of my weekly radio show that I did a full hour-long set, my radio show, with this mixer hooked up to Ableton. I didn't necessarily utilize this even to a fraction of its full potential during that video, but at least you can see a little bit of the basic use of the mixer. Anyway, if you get a chance to play with one ever, do it. Thank you very much for watching.
I discovered some music that would change my life.